We actually covered this text kind of briefly when we were doing the series on the character of God. So I'd say we kind of we touched on it a little bit. Today we're going to take a closer look at it. It's the parable. Well, it's Luke 15 verses 11 to 32. I'm the reader for today, so the words are up here on the screen. If you brought your Bibles, you can follow along that way as well. So this is Jesus, and it says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he, the father, divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to the father, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" This parable is arguably one of the most well-known parables in the Gospels. It is the parable that has been used by a number of different people. Oh, my mic's not thinking. There we go. Oh, so before I begin, so a parable, this is a quick recap. I forgot I put this in here. So a quick recap. What is a parable? What does it do? A parable functions as a lens that allows us to see the truth that is correct, the truth, and to correct our distorted vision. So the parables, they awaken insight, they stimulate the conscious, they move us to action. They do these 3 things. That was the intent behind the parables that Jesus shared during his time in his ministry. It's the same that applied to us today. This quote comes out of Klein Snodgrass's book, Stories with Intent, which is a really good book if you're looking to understand the parables. So next slide for me there, please. So this parable, this parable, it's one of the most well-known ones. It's one that famously was painted by Rembrandt, the artist. That's the picture over here on your right. That's a picture of what Rembrandt would call the prodigal son. The guy on the left with the earring, William Shakespeare. his writings, most of his writings actually are framed in this story of the prodigal son. It's what's unique about this sort of parable is that it actually has a few different names. If you go to the next slide there for me, Jan, the title we often, the church has often referred to it as the parable of the prodigal son. But depending on your translation or depending on your interpretation, it could also be the parable of the waiting and loving father. It could be the one that I really like, the one that I feel like is a good fit for us this morning, and one I'll probably keep using is the parable of the compassionate father and his two lost sons, because both his sons are lost. Both of his sons are missing something. Now today, as we continue to study here, there is one big idea, one key takeaway that if you're leaving here this morning, I want you to have, and that is there is a party at God's kingdom, and you are invited. It's simple as that. There is a party. God is throwing a party at his kingdom, and you're invited. You. And you can invite others to it as well, actually. Now, we'll kind of spend our time here. We're going to go through a little bit of an outline here, what to expect. If you go to the next slide there for me. So we're going to look at the four parts of this parable. This parable has four sections. There's an introduction. There is this little story of the younger son that we hear about. There is the reunion of the younger son and his father. And then there's this interaction between the father and the older son. So we'll go through those four things. We will then take all of that and ask the question, what is Jesus saying in this parable? What is he trying to tell us? We'll wrap up our time then with a little conclusion and some things to reflect on. A couple literary notes just before we get into it. This parable, the parable of the compassionate father and his two lost sons, or if it's more comfortably, the parable of the prodigal son, is the third parable in a series that Jesus is giving in Luke 15. Anyone here willing to take a guess at what the other two parables are? See if you know your Bible trivia. Lost coin, and there's one other one. Lost sheep. There are two other parables prior to this. Congratulations. Give them all a round of applause. These two, this Luke 15, these three parables, so the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, they all have this one thing in common: finding joy in something that was once lost. All three parables tell the exact same thing. Jesus uses these three parables to highlight that there is great joy that comes when something is lost, or there's great joy when something that is lost gets found. And Jesus sort of gives three different examples for this, and this is the one that we get to look at today. So let's look at the introduction of this parable. This is the verses 11 and 12. So we've got our characters here. We've got the father, and he's got two sons, an older son and a younger son. The younger son, according to the story, goes to his father and says, "I want my bit of the inheritance. Give me my part of the estate." Now, this is not an off-the-wall request. This younger son, asking his father to really most likely give him the money, whatever money is owed to him, is due to him. Him asking for it is actually not as crazy of a request. And the reason being is because this father, if he were to have more children, well, then that younger son, who would then become the middle child, would get a smaller piece of the pie. And if the father had another son, well, then that piece of the pie gets smaller. Sidebar, little freebie, if that father somehow adopts children, that piece of the pie becomes even smaller, because adopted children inherit part of the estate. At the same time, the older brother, the firstborn, would get 2/3 of the estate. So he's already working with just 1/3, and then it keeps getting a little bit smaller and smaller. So this younger son is likely thinking ahead and thinking, well, we would hope, is thinking a little bit further down the road and thinking, I'm going to try to get what I can get now because I don't want to have less, and I want to try to hopefully use that. Now, unfortunately, this younger son, the younger brother, does not make wise decisions. So if we go to the next slide there for me. See, what had happened was this. The younger son leaves home. And as the younger son leaves home, he participates in what the Bible describes as wild living. And it depends on your translation. Some of the older translations use the term prostitute. I will allow you and your imaginations to imagine what wild living looks like. Maybe it's eating chocolate chip cookies in the morning like me. Maybe it's a little more. I'm not here to judge. Nonetheless, this younger son, he leaves home and he spends all of his estate on a wild living. And then he encounters a very, very common thing in the ancient Near East, which is a famine. There is suddenly a loss of food. There's no food. And the son, the younger son, is no money and no food. So he's in a foreign land with no money, no food, and no status. See, he was at home, he at least had status. He was at least known as the younger son. He had a name. He had some sort of social credit that he could use, that in a pinch he could rely on, and he doesn't. So just for a moment, let's imagine that. Imagine being in a foreign place, away from your home, and you have no money, you have no food, and no one knows or really cares who you are. Those are some desperate times, I would say. Those are some significantly desperate times. And so the story, Jesus tells us that the son starts working not for another family or working for even a master. He gives no name. He just says he starts working for a citizen, just a regular old person of this town. And this person happens to own pigs. This is a big no-no for the Jewish community. Jewish people at this time, even today, do not spend time with pigs. Pigs are unclean. You cannot spend, you cannot, work with a pig. You don't eat pig. You don't eat pork. It is so extreme that within Jewish law, the Levitical law we call it, there are these supportive books or these commentary books referred to as the Mishnah and the Talmud. And within the Mishnah and the Talmud, it actually says that any person, Jewish or not, any person who works with a pig or spends time with a pig, they're cursed. That's how significant it was to working with a pig. And so this son, who's in a foreign land with no money, no food, no status, is now considered cursed by his own people. And I would imagine that when he got to that point, when that sank in, the food that the pigs were eating seemed appropriate. Seemed like this is the best I'm ever going to get now. The son, this younger son, he swallows his pride. He comes to his senses, whatever cliche you want to use. He says, you know what, I'm going to go back home. And what's interesting is when he says that he's going back home, he says he's going to work for his father. The phrase is that he says he thinks of what his father's servants are eating and how they're living, and he thinks, I could go back and do that because at least they're being treated better. What this speaks to is that the son has sort of come to this realization that I can't go back home as a son. I have to go back as an employee. I have to go and work for my father. I don't get to just return and be a son to my father. I no longer get to be inside the home where I had food and shelter and clothing and a status. I go back and I'm outside the home. And this is risky. This is significantly risky for the son. And that's because throughout just the Bible, and this is supported through other Jewish texts, that son returns with this significant mark against him. He will be forever known. If he goes back home, he will be forever known as the foolish one. And there are some verses here that support that. So Proverbs 27:10 says, do not forsake your friend or a friend of your family, and do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes you. Better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. And essentially, don't go back home. Don't go back home because you don't want to have to bear what you're going to have to deal with. So go find someone else. Proverbs 28:7 tells us, a discerning son heeds instruction, but a companion of gluttons disgraces his father. In verse 19, those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies will have their fill of poverty. So this son, these are the things that are likely going through his mind as he's traveling back home. But the one that I would argue may be stuck in his mind the most comes out of the book of Deuteronomy, the Levitical law that says this. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them, when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him down to the elders at the gate of the town. That's where a lot of things happen, the city gate. They shall say to the elders, to all the wise people of the town, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. It's the way that this son would likely be described. The next line is, then all the men of his town are to stone him to death, because you must purge the evil from among you, and all of Israel will hear of it and be afraid. This son is risking going back to his father's house, to his hometown, and being an object lesson of when you do not listen to wisdom. That the rest of the town is going to learn, don't do what he did. I can't even imagine what that trip back must have been like. But he takes it. The son heads home. What I love about this story, go to the next slide there for me, Jan. Jesus says that the father sees his son. What this means is that this father was actively looking for his son to come back. This father was at the very least hoping on the horizon he would see that similar walk that he's known for years. He was hopeful. He was on the lookout, and he sees him. And when his father sees his son, he gets this feeling in his gut. The Bible translates that as compassion. And if you remember when we did our study on the character of God, when we talked about his compassion, that word, you feel it in your gut. It's something you feel in your intestines. That's what the father did. So the father feels this compassion in his gut that stirs him up so much, this emotional response to go to his son, that he runs. Old men in the Bible don't run. And it's not because they can't physically run. Old men don't run in the Bible because it is a disgraceful thing to do. When you've lived a long time and you are considered an elder of the community, you are a wise person, you don't run. That's beneath you. At the same time, if you run, back then they wore these longer things called tunics, kind of like a robe. You got to hike that tunic up. And you can't show ankle in the first century, people. That's a no-no. That's right up there with eating pork. You can't do that. And so the thought of this, if we're thinking the first century audience, those that hearing this for the first time, when Jesus says that the Father ran to greet his Son, they're like, oh, no way, no. Old men don't run. Old men don't hike up their tunics, especially for a son who did this. And yet that's what compassion does. But there's another reason, a more important reason why the Father ran. See, the Father was risking some of his status, some of his, when his Son comes back. And so we could say, well, maybe he's running to get his Son because he wants to make sure that he is the first one to chastise and to discipline his Son, because he wants to make sure that the community knows that I'll take care of it. It's my kid. I'll take care of it. I'd argue there's a different reason. Why don't you go to the next slide there for me, Jan? The Greek word for run is treko. And it's the word, it means to run, it means to run swiftly. It is most often used, the word treko is most often used, not just in the Bible, but in other Greek writing, describing a race between different people. Okay, well, if the Father is trying to outrun or run faster than other people, why? Well, one, he's moved by compassion. I think the second reason is what's referred to as the Kezazah ceremony. Now, Kenneth Bailey he's a scholar, he's a historian. Phenomenal. If you're looking for someone to read, and if you want to understand what life was like in the first century, what life was like for Jesus as he's kind of in this ancient Near East, Palestinian world, Kenneth Bailey has phenomenal books about that. Kenneth Bailey describes in one of his books about the prodigal son what is referred to as the Kezazah ceremony. So any Jewish boy who lost his inheritance among Gentiles, so among non-Jewish people, which this son likely had done, faced the ceremony if he dared return to his home village. The ceremony itself was simple. Fellow villagers would fill a large earthenware pot. So let's imagine like a big, big vase with burned nuts and burned corn, and break it in front of the guilty individual. So what they would do is they would stand at the city gates and they would wait for that person to come forward, and they wouldn't let them in the city gates, and then they would take this giant pot and when they would smash it in front of them. And they would say, and then while they do is they would all shout, everyone in the town, they would say, so-and-so, the name of the person, is cut off from his people. From that point on, the village would have nothing to do with this hapless lad. As he leaves town, the prodigal knows he must not lose his money among the Gentiles. The prodigal son, the younger son, knows that when he leaves, if he squanders and wastes his inheritance, he comes back to that, a smashed pot in front of him. Not if his dad gets to him first. See, if his dad gets to him first, he can be his defense. He can stand between the angry mob and the pot and his son and say, hey, I'll take care of this. I got this. We read about that because then what we hear is that the father says, before anyone can get into the ceremony, he says, put the best robe on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Putting sandals on someone's feet was the job of a servant. A job that the son probably saw happen often when he was in a foreign land. The father says, get him back to who he's supposed to be. And then find a fattened calf, not just a goat. We're going all out. We're not eating Sizzlers. We're eating filet mignon tonight, y'all, because he's back. We have to celebrate this. And that stems from this deep sense of joy that this son that was once dead is alive, that this son that was once lost is found again. He's come back home. Unfortunately, there is someone missing from this party, and that's the older brother. there's not much said about the older brother. According to Jesus, there's this kind of brief interaction between the father and the older brother, and the older brother seems to show this frustration, this anger with his father because he's done everything right, and he doesn't even get a goat. But yet the son who ran away and spent all the money, he gets the life, he gets everything that I've ever wanted. Why? What Jesus is doing here is he's trying to show us this very extreme example of the difference between a celebration and disdain. Now, disdain's kind of I was trying to think of what's a good, so disdain is the word that I kept reading over and over again. And it's not really a word that we use often, but it's often the word disdain is sort of a way to describe something that is dirty or bloodied or unrecognizable, something that is disdained. So Jesus is sort of setting up this example, saying, listen, this is what a celebration looks like when we find the thing that we once lost, and this is what it looks like when we view that thing as bloodied and messy and dirty. And actually what it does is it's a reflection on our own character, that we kind of become disdained. And what that ultimately does, Jesus would say, is when he says that everything that I have belongs to you, he's saying, listen, a picture of my kingdom is not a picture of disdain. A picture of my kingdom is a picture of a celebration. It's a party, and you're all invited. So what is Jesus saying in this parable to us this morning? We'll answer them back then. Can I go to the next slide there for me, please? Thank you. I think Jesus is saying, he's saying four things. The first thing he's saying is to the audience in the first century and to us today, is he is confronting us, the audience, with a compelling picture of what the kingdom looks like. That what Jesus is presenting to them and to us is a challenging idea of what God's kingdom truly looks like. See, for the first century, you had this group known as the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, if you're new to church or to the Bible, the Pharisees were these religious people who were smart, and they knew the Old Testament. They knew all the right things to say and the right places to be. They knew all the laws, the do's and the don'ts. They know. Pharisees, I say this here, probably I've said it before, it bears worth repeating. Pharisees often get a kind of a bad rap in the Bible. Like they get kind of written as like these evil people. Pharisees today are likely the elders and deacons of your church. I don't say that to say that they're evil. What I mean is that Pharisees in the first century were simply people trying to do their best. It's what we would consider today as someone who goes to church every Sunday, tithes, does all the right things. However, what set the Pharisees apart, where they had something sort of missing, is that because of that lifestyle, because of the way that they understood the Bible, the Old Testament, and their relationship with God, is they had this very narrow view of what salvation was. Very, very narrow view. A point of view that would exclude the younger son. And so Jesus is sort of challenging the audience and saying, who really gets to go to my Father's house? Who gets invited? Jesus is trying to widen that out a little bit for the audience. And the way that Jesus does that is by showing how wide and how great God's compassion is. And that compassion is so great, so overwhelming that it overflows to the point where it's an invitation to celebrate. It's an invitation to rejoice. That it's not just this sort of singular event where the thing that was once lost is found and we say, all right, we found it, way to go. No, it is so great and so grand that we get other people like, hey, we all got to celebrate this. This is exciting stuff. Klein Snodgrass in his commentary. I can't remember. Can you go to the next slide, Jan? I can't remember. Yeah. This is the one thing that Klein Snodgrass says, I think really kind of maybe hits the point. He says, what Jesus is saying there, that if God accepts such people, not just generally, but specifically because of the presence of his kingdom, and if Jesus eating with these sinners or spending time with these sinners enacts God's forgiveness and mercy, then the complaints about the actions of Jesus are clearly misguided and out of touch of what God is doing. If I could maybe summarize that or say that differently, that if we've got a problem with the idea that God welcomes in the younger son into his kingdom, then we've got a problem with Jesus. I don't want to have a problem with Jesus. And I don't want our church to have a problem with Jesus. A couple concluding thoughts here as we wrap up. Go to that next slide there for me, Jan. I mentioned this in prayer this morning. This is a story of radical grace. Radical, countercultural, off the wall, hard to believe kind of grace. That's what this story is. And so this story then challenges many religious assumptions. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you grew up going to church your whole life. You went to Sunday school, you went to youth group. And through all those wonderful things, it had this sort of unhealthy byproduct of creating a narrow view of salvation. This has challenged my religious assumptions. Because often what happens is that I look at a person's life and the decisions they're making, I think, they ain't coming back from that. The trajectory they're on is the one they're going to stay on. I couldn't be more wrong about that. This story is a picture that where someone is today does not mean that's where they'll always be. And that God is always looking for them. He is actively looking for them to come back. That's why this story is an invitation. It's an invitation for two groups of people. It's an invitation for people like me who grew up in the church. It's an invitation for us to learn what it means to rejoice and celebrate when people have an experience with God that transforms them. And that can be someone like the younger son who has spent their life on wild living, or it could be like the older son who has to come to terms that they are self-centered and missing out. It's an invitation for me to celebrate and rejoice what God is doing. And it's also an invitation for those here who can relate to that younger son's life. Who can say, yep, that sounds like me. It's an invitation for you to be embraced by the Father who is running after you right now. Wants to wrap you up in his arms, in his compassion, in his gut, because he simply can't hold it back. And know this, that if you make that decision, you are surrounded by people here who are going to celebrate with you. I want to wrap up our time here with reflect, relate, and practice. So a question to reflect on: have you ever seen or experienced radical grace? The grace that we read about in this story. Relate, what part of this story feels like your story? Church is an okay place to be okay, right? Is church an okay place to be okay? I think so. I identify more probably with the older brother. Well, I did. God's grace has tempered me. A practice. And this is how I think God has tempered me. This is something that I learned actually from my pastor growing up. So this is not an original thought. This is something I'm passing on to you. In my life, when I have wanted to have a better understanding of God's kingdom, when I've wanted to have a better grasp of what the compassion and grace and mercy of God is truly like, my prayer, and for me, I pray this just before I get up every morning, has been, God, open the eyes and ears of my heart so I can better hear and see you today. It's a simple prayer. And again, I've learned this from my pastor growing up. What I've experienced is that when I pray this prayer, my heart begins to change. And it begins to soften. And it begins to see what God is doing. And so I invite you this week to pray that prayer. Maybe when your alarm goes off in the morning before you get up, you don't have to get your head off the pillow. God, give me the eyes and ears, open the eyes and ears of my heart so I can better hear and see you today. Before you go to bed, as you're eating, as you're driving, try it. Let me know how it goes. I'd be curious. All right, friends. Would you please join me as we close out this time here in prayer? Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for waking us up. God, I thank you for being a compassionate God, a God whose gut moves you to run towards us. Father, I thank you for the younger sons in this room. God, that you know them, that you call them by name, that you are actively pursuing them. And so, Spirit, may you soften their hearts, woo them by your grace back to the Father's house. And Father, for the older sons here this morning, Father, may our religious assumptions be challenged. God, may we see just how deep and wide your grace is for this world. In Spirit, may you open the eyes and ears of our hearts as individuals and as a church who's a part of this community so that we can better hear and see the riches you have for us, for our family, our friends, for Cedar Springs, for our state and our world. We pray all this now in Jesus' name. Amen. If you're able to, I invite you to stand as we close out this time here as we sing.